The name of Portland, Oregon was decided by a coin toss. A copper penny minted in 1835 flipped 3 times in the parlor of a Hudson's Bay Company trader's home in Oregon City on an evening in 1845. The 2 men flipping it, Asa Lovejoy and Francis Pettygrove, couldn't agree on what to call a 640-acre clearing they co-owned along the Willamette River. Lovejoy, a lawyer from Massachusetts, wanted Boston. Pettygrove, a merchant from Maine, wanted Portland. Best 2 out of 3. Pettygrove won. He fished the penny off the floor and pocketed it. That coin is still on display at the Oregon Historical Society, and it remains, as far as anyone can tell, the only time a major American city got its name from a game of chance. But the real gamble wasn't the name. It was the bet that the clearing would amount to anything at all. Consider what Portland was up against. In 1845, it sat roughly 2,000 miles from the nearest American settlement of any consequence, St. Louis, roughly, if you were counting overland, and the trail between them killed people every season. The territory was still jointly occupied by the United States and Great Britain. The Oregon Treaty that would settle the border wasn't signed until the following year. And Portland was not even the obvious town site in its own neighborhood. Oregon City, 15 miles up the Willamette, was the end of the Oregon Trail, the seat of the provisional government, and already had a sawmill built by the Hudson's Bay Company's John McLaughlin. It had population, momentum, and legitimacy. Milwaukee, a few miles south of Portland, had an aggressive promoter in Lot Whitcomb. St. Helens, downstream on the Columbia, had better access to the open Pacific. Linton had backers with money. Within 20 miles of Portland's claim, there were at least 5 towns that, on paper, had stronger cases for becoming the dominant city of Oregon. And the land itself was blanketed in old-growth forest so thick that the men clearing it couldn't even remove the stumps. They'd cut the trees for lumber and firewood, but the root systems were enormous, the labor backbreaking, and the manpower scarce, so the stumps just stayed. Hundreds of them, standing 3 and 4 feet high in what were supposed to be streets. Locals whitewashed them so people could see them at night and wouldn't trip. They used them as stepping stones to cross the mud. By the early 1850s, a rival town promoter up the river at St. Helens dismissed the settlement as Little Stump Town, and the name stuck. Portland was Stump Town, a muddy clearing full of whitewashed tree stumps at the end of the earth, named by a coin flip. That is where this story begins. And here is why the story is almost impossible to believe. Within 60 years, Stumptown would become the largest city in the Pacific Northwest, would have a grand hotel designed by the most celebrated architecture firm in America, would host a World's Fair that drew over 1.5 million paying visitors, and would be home to more than 200,000 people. All of it built, essentially, on a series of bets that should not have paid off, but did, each time by the narrowest of margins. Each time because one specific person saw something that everyone else missed. The first person who saw it was a sea captain from Newburyport, Massachusetts, named John Hurd Couch. Between 1840 and 1845, Couch made 3 voyages from New England to the Pacific coast, sailing ships loaded with goods for the fledgling Oregon settlements. On those voyages, he did something that no one else had thought to do carefully. He took depth soundings of the Willamette River. What he found was the key to Portland's entire future. Ocean-going vessels, the big ships, the ones that could carry real cargo, could navigate up the Willamette from its confluence with the Columbia to approximately the site of Lovejoy and Pettygrove's clearing. Past that point, the river grew shallow, and further south, at Oregon City, the Willamette Falls made navigation impossible. Oregon City was then the largest settlement in the territory, the end of the Oregon Trail, the place with momentum. But Oregon City couldn't receive deep draft ships. Portland could. Couch grasped what this meant. He persuaded Lovejoy and Pettygrove to properly plat their town site, and he filed his own adjacent land claim just to the north of theirs, what became Couch's Addition, the heart of what is now northwest Portland. It was such a simple insight, the head of deep-water navigation. Whoever controlled the last point where the big ships could anchor controlled the trade. Oregon City had the history, the population, the government. The rival town of Milwaukee, a few miles south of Portland, had aggressive promoters. St. Helens, downstream on the Columbia, had a more obvious location for ocean traffic. Linton had backers. But Portland had the depth, and in an era when rivers were highways and railroads hadn't arrived, depth was everything. The next piece of improbable luck came from California. In January 1848, gold was discovered at Sutter's Mill, and within months the entire Pacific Coast economy was rearranged. San Francisco exploded with miners who needed food, lumber, and supplies, and didn't care what they paid for them. Portland, sitting atop vast forests and the agricultural output of the Willamette Valley, became a supply depot almost overnight. Captain Couch himself was among the first to capitalize. He and his brother-in-law, Captain George Flanders, filled their ship's holds with lumber and provisions and sailed for San Francisco in early 1849. Couch reportedly sold lumber there at $600 per 1,000 board feet, an astonishing price in an era when lumber in Oregon sold for a fraction of that. Other Portland merchants followed. Wheat from the Willamette Valley farms went south. Salted salmon, barrel staves, shingles, anything California miners would buy, Portland shipped. Pettygrove himself, who by then had been running a profitable three-cornered trade between Portland, San Francisco, and Hawaii, was one of the wealthiest men in the Oregon Territory. Money flowed north. Before the gold rush, cash was so scarce in Oregon that people paid their debts in wheat, in orders drawn on the Hudson's Bay Company, even in leather. After 1849, Portland had an economy. Its population, barely a few hundred souls at the time of the gold discovery, began to climb in earnest. By 1850, the census counted 821 residents, small by any Eastern standard, but the largest settlement in the Pacific Northwest. Portland had surpassed Oregon City. It would never fall behind again. And now the men who would truly build the city arrived. In April 1851, 3 months after Portland was formally chartered by the territorial legislature, a 25-year-old former railroad station agent from New Hampshire named William Sergeant Ladd stepped off a steamer onto Portland's muddy riverfront. The federal census the previous year had counted 821 residents, making Portland the largest settlement in the Pacific Northwest. Ladd had come with a modest consignment of wine and liquor. He sold it within months and turned about $2,000 in profit. Within 2 years, he had built Portland's first brick building. In 1854, at 28, he was elected mayor, the youngest in the city's history. And in April 1859, just weeks after Oregon achieved statehood, Ladd and his old schoolmate Charles Tilton opened the Ladd and Tilton Bank, the first bank in Oregon. Its starting capital was $50,000. That bank became the financial engine of a city. Its starting capital of $50,000 tripled within 3 years. Ladd was not a flamboyant man. He was a careful, relentless accumulator who understood that in a frontier economy, the man who controls the capital controls everything else. He invested in nearly everything Portland touched. The Oregon Steam Navigation Company, which by 1860 had consolidated and monopolized Columbia River trade and generated some of the largest fortunes in the territory. The Oregon Telegraph Company. The Oregon Iron Company at Oswego, which produced the first iron on the Pacific Coast. The Oregon Central Railroad. He set aside 1/10 of his income for charity from the beginning, not out of sentimentality, but because he believed a city without institutions was a city without a future. He donated space for the public library in his brick building and kept it there for 24 years. The Oregonian's editor, writing Ladd's obituary in 1893, said that his biography wants but little of being also the history of Portland. He was the wealthiest man in the Pacific Northwest when he died, and his estate would shape the city's residential development for another generation. Ladd's Addition, Eastmoreland, Westmoreland, whole neighborhoods platted on land he had quietly purchased decades earlier. 40 acres of his Crystal Springs farm became the campus of Reed College. Henry Corbett arrived in Portland the same year as Ladd, 1851. He started in hardware, moved into banking, became a United States Senator. Between them, Ladd and Corbett represented something unusual for a frontier town: patient capital. These were not speculators looking to make a quick turn and move on. They reinvested. They built institutions. Corbett would later lead the syndicate that finished the city's most important building. Portland's merchant class behaved from very early on as though the city's future was a settled fact, even when, by any objective measure, it was not. Because by the 1870s, Portland had a serious problem. The city had grown to about 8,000 people, was doing substantial business in wheat and lumber exports, and had established itself as the commercial capital of the Pacific Northwest. But it had no railroad. The Transcontinental Railroad had reached the Pacific coast, but at Sacramento, not Portland. The Northern Pacific Railroad, chartered in 1864 to build from the Great Lakes to Puget Sound, had chosen Tacoma, Washington as its western terminus, not Portland. If the railroad bypassed Portland, the city's future as a deep-water trading post had a ceiling. It would never become something more. This is where the story of Portland becomes almost operatic, because the man who saved the city was one of the most unlikely figures in American business history. Henry Villard was born Ferdinand Heinrich Gustav Hilgard in Speyer, Bavaria in 1835, the son of a judge on the Bavarian Supreme Court. He argued with his father over politics. The father was a rigid monarchist, the son was not. And at 18, to avoid being forced into military service, he secretly emigrated to America. He changed his name to Henry Villard to prevent his father from finding him. He taught himself English, became a journalist, covered the Lincoln-Douglas debates for a German-language newspaper, reported on the Civil War for the New York Herald, married the daughter of abolitionist William Lloyd Garrison, and then, having no background in business whatsoever, pivoted into railroad finance. By the late 1870s, Villard had gained control of the Oregon Railway and Navigation Company, which operated steamship and rail lines along the Columbia River. He was not a Portlander. He was not even, in any conventional sense, a businessman. He was a Bavarian immigrant journalist who had talked his way into controlling Oregon's most important transportation company. And he envisioned Portland, not Tacoma, as the great rail terminus of the Northwest. The directors of the Northern Pacific refused to reroute. So Villard did something that has almost no precedent in American financial history. In early 1881, he went to his banking contacts, many of them German investors who trusted him based on his prior successes, and asked them to put money into an unnamed venture. He would not tell them what the investment was for. He would not tell them what company they were buying. He asked them to trust him, personally, with their capital, no questions asked. This was the famous blind pool. The numbers vary by source. Some say $8 million, others say $12 million, but the result was the same: enough money to take control of the Northern Pacific Railroad itself. Villard was elected president of the Northern Pacific, shifted the western terminus from Tacoma to Portland, and on September 15, 1883, the first regularly scheduled Northern Pacific transcontinental passenger train arrived in Portland via the Oregon Railway and Navigation Company's trackage from Wallula, Washington. Portland was connected to the rest of America. But Villard had overextended spectacularly. The costs of construction, the debt load, the sheer audacity of the financial structure, it all came crashing down within months. By December 1883, Villard had resigned from the presidencies of the Northern Pacific, the Oregon Railway and Navigation Company, and the Oregon and Transcontinental Company. He reportedly fled to Berlin. The empire he had built on faith and German capital collapsed around him. The railroad, however, stayed. and Villard had left behind something else, the beginnings of the most ambitious building Portland had ever attempted. In 1882, anticipating the railroad's arrival, Villard had purchased a full city block immediately west of the Pioneer Courthouse, Portland's handsome Federal building, completed in 1873, and commissioned the New York firm of McKim, Mead, and White to design a luxury hotel. This was not a provincial gesture. McKim, Mead, and White were, at that moment, arguably the most important architecture firm in the United States. They would go on to design the Boston Public Library, Penn Station, and much of the campus at Columbia University. And Henry Villard was asking them to build a palace of hospitality in a city that 10 years earlier had been full of tree stumps. Construction began. One story of the hotel rose from its foundations. Then Villard's finances collapsed and everything stopped. The unfinished walls stood exposed to the rain, transients sheltered in the abandoned structure. Portlanders began calling it Villard's Ruins. For years, the skeleton of the hotel sat on that block like a monument to ambition gone wrong, a half-built promise at the center of the city, designed by New York's finest, paid for by vanished money, going nowhere. It was Henry Corbett who finally intervened. Along with fellow Portland establishment figures William Ladd, Henry Failing, and Simeon Reed, Corbett formed a syndicate to finish the hotel. George Markle, Jr., a newcomer who recognized that completing the project was his ticket into Portland's inner circle, campaigned for subscriptions. Over 150 Portlanders put up money. By this time, McKim, Mead, and White were too busy to supervise the completion, so the syndicate turned to William Whidden, a young architect who had worked in McKim's office and had been sent to Portland originally to oversee construction. Whidden persuaded his friend Ion Lewis to join him from Boston, and together they formed the firm of Whidden and Lewis, made only minor changes to the original design, and finished the building. The Portland Hotel opened in 1890, 8 stories, 326 guest rooms, electrically illuminated throughout, every room, every corridor. An H-shaped plan with towers nestled into the corners of its entrance court, lower walls of rough, dark basalt quarried locally, upper stories of brick, the whole thing crowned with high-hipped roofs and dormers in the Queen Anne and Chateau-esque style. The entrance court opened onto Southwest 6th Avenue, directly across from the Pioneer Courthouse, so that a guest stepping out the front door looked straight at the most dignified federal building in the territory. The total cost exceeded $1 million. It had taken 8 years from groundbreaking to opening, survived 1 bankruptcy, 1 set of ruins, and 1 complete change of ownership. It was, at the time, the second most luxurious hotel west of the Mississippi, surpassed in size only by the Palace Hotel in San Francisco. Remember, this was a city that 45 years earlier had been purchased for $5,000 in leather. And it had been built by local money in a city that had existed for 45 years, designed by America's greatest architects, finished by a man who loved the place so much, he stayed and became one of its most important builders. William Whidden had come to Portland as McKim's man on the ground, expected to supervise a construction project and go home. Instead, he looked at this city of 46,000 people at the edge of the continent and decided it was where he wanted to spend his life. Whidden and Lewis would design dozens of Portland's finest buildings over the next 3 decades. City Hall, the Portland Public Library, private homes for the merchant elite, becoming the architectural firm that gave Portland its visual identity. The hotel itself became the social center of the city, the place where deals were made over dinner, where presidents were received with ceremony, where Portland demonstrated to itself and to the world that it was no longer Stumptown. President Benjamin Harrison stayed there in 1891, the year after it opened. The city that gathered around the Portland Hotel in the 1890s was growing at a rate that would have seemed inconceivable a generation earlier. The population that had been about 8,000 in 1870 was 17,000 by 1880, 46,000 by 1890, and by 1900 it would reach 90,000. Every decade brought a near doubling. The manufacturing sector, negligible before 1870, had by 1890 grown to 600 firms employing over 7,000 workers on a working capital of $14 million, producing an annual output worth $20 million. Flour mills, iron foundries, furniture factories, tanneries, canneries, the industrial base was diversifying. Streetcar lines radiated outward across both sides of the river. Bridges spanned the Willamette, and there would eventually be so many that Portland earned yet another nickname, Bridgetown. The Chinese community, drawn by railroad work and mining, was the second largest on the West Coast after San Francisco's. Immigrants arrived from Scandinavia, Germany, Japan, Italy, Russia. By 1910, the largest contingents of foreign-born Portlanders came from the British Isles, Canada, China, Germany, and Sweden. Portland was a real city now, built of brick and basalt and immigrant labor and reinvested capital, and it wanted the world to know. On the morning of June 1st, 1905, Portland's grandest parade assembled at the corner of 6th and Montgomery. Mounted police led off, followed by marching bands and 2,000 National Guardsmen. At the Portland Hotel, the column parted to make way for the carriage of Vice President Charles Fairbanks. Their destination was a 400-acre fairground built on a marshy slough called Gild's Lake on the northwest edge of the city. There, before an opening day crowd of 40,000, the Lewis and Clark Centennial Exposition officially began. It ran from June 1st through October 15th. Portland's population at the time was roughly 120,000. 2 years of landscaping had transformed Gild's Lake, a marshy slough surrounded by dairies and truck farms, into terraced building sites leading down to a sparkling lake kept fresh with water pumped from the Willamette. The exhibition halls went up on the bluffs overlooking the water. Inside, visitors marveled at moving picture shows and electric gadgetry. Outside, motorized blimps hovered in the sky. Over the 4.5 months of the fair, 1,588,000 paying visitors passed through the gates, more than 13 times the city's population. Over 400,000 came from outside the Pacific Northwest, a staggering number of tourists for a city most Americans would have struggled to find on a map. At night, the fairgrounds blazed with 100,000 electric lamps outlining every building, every walkway, every bridge. The fair turned a net profit of $84,000, making it one of the few American World's expositions to end in the black. Portland had been, for 4 months, the first city on the West Coast to host a World's Fair, and the city used every minute of it. Real estate boomed. New residents arrived by the thousands. The railroad construction that followed, the Great Northern and Union Pacific expanding branch lines into eastern Oregon and Washington, channeled still more commerce through Portland. Wheat, cattle, sheep, fruit from the interior all reached national and international markets through Portland's docks, creating jobs for factory workers, longshoremen, bankers, wholesalers, and insurance agents. In the decades surrounding the exposition, Portland's population roughly doubled, from 90,000 to over 200,000. This was Portland's peak of ambition, and the men who built it knew how to mark the moment. Simon Benson had arrived in Oregon from Norway as a teenager in the 1860s, worked his way up through the timber industry, and by the turn of the century was one of the wealthiest lumber operators in the Pacific Northwest. Around 1910, he sold his timber holdings for approximately $4.5 million, an enormous sum, and turned to philanthropy with the same intensity he'd brought to logging. He gave $100,000 to help build Benson Polytechnic High School. He donated the land around Multnomah Falls to the public. He championed the construction of the Columbia River Highway, one of the great scenic roads in America. And in 1912, reportedly because he was tired of his lumber workers showing up drunk on Monday mornings, Benson gave the city $10,000 for the installation of 20 bronze drinking fountains, 4-lobed, continuously flowing, designed by Portland architect A.E. Doyle. They became known as the Benson Bubblers, and they still run today, more than a century later, in downtown Portland. The man wanted his workers to have an alternative to whiskey. He gave the city one of its most enduring symbols. By 1910, Portland's population had reached 207,000, but that same census revealed something that must have stung. Seattle, powered by the Klondike Gold Rush of 1897 and its role as the gateway to Alaska, had surpassed Portland for the first time at 237,000. The crown of the Pacific Northwest, held since the 1850s, had quietly passed north. Portland would never get it back. The city didn't collapse, it kept growing, more slowly, through the 1910s and 20s. New bridges crossed the Willamette. Portland would eventually have more bridges than any city in Oregon and earn another nickname, Bridgetown. Union Station, designed by Van Brunt and Howe, had opened in 1896 with its iconic clock tower. The Benson Hotel opened in 1913. Pittock Mansion, the French Renaissance chateau built by Oregonian publisher Henry Pittock, high in the West Hills, was completed in 1914, a house so grand its owner never fully moved in. The streetcar system expanded. Portland settled into the steady, conservative prosperity that its establishment class had always preferred. A city run by bankers and merchants who distrusted flash, who built for permanence, who would rather be solvent than spectacular. Then came the war, and everything changed again. When the United States entered World War II, Portland had a population of about 305,000. It was a solid, working city: lumber, shipping, manufacturing, food processing. But it was not an industrial powerhouse on the scale of Detroit or Pittsburgh. That changed almost overnight when Henry J. Kaiser chose the Portland-Vancouver area for his shipyards. Kaiser was already one of the most consequential industrialists in America. He had built Boulder Dam and Grand Coulee Dam, and he knew how to think at a scale that made other people uncomfortable. He picked Portland in part because of the cheap hydroelectric power from the recently completed Bonneville Dam, and in part because the Columbia River gave him deep water access to the Pacific. He built 3 massive shipyards in the area, and his operation didn't just meet wartime production targets, it shattered them, producing Liberty ships and other vessels at a pace 75% faster than the national average. Kaiser's yards launched a ship every 10 days. Portland, the city that had waited 38 years for a railroad, was now building the fleet that would win the Pacific War. The workers poured in. Over 72,000 new arrivals during the war years, and Portland had nowhere to put them. So Kaiser, in characteristic fashion, solved the problem himself. With federal funding, he purchased a 648-acre floodplain on the Columbia River between Portland and Vancouver and built a city. They called it Vanport, a portmanteau of Vancouver and Portland. It went up in 110 days. Over 10,000 apartment units, hastily framed with no cement foundations, temporary by design. When it opened in the summer of 1943, its roughly 35,000 residents made it Oregon's second largest city, a city that hadn't existed 6 months earlier. At its wartime peak, Vanport housed over 40,000 people, including an estimated 6,000 to 10,000 African Americans, more than 3 times the entire black population of Portland before the war. Many had come from the South, drawn by the promise of good-paying shipyard jobs, and for many of them, Vanport was the first place in their lives where they could earn a real wage. The housing was segregated, though the schools, remarkably, were integrated, the first integrated schools in Oregon. After the war ended, the shipyard jobs vanished. Portland's civic leaders urged the wartime workers to leave. Many did, but many didn't. By 1948, about 18,500 people still lived in Vanport, families who had put down roots, veterans who had returned and were attending classes at the Vanport Extension Center, which would eventually become Portland State University. The housing was never meant to be permanent. The building sat on a floodplain, protected from the Columbia River by a railroad embankment that doubled as a dike. On the morning of May 30th, 1948, Memorial Day, a Sunday, the Housing Authority of Portland issued a bulletin to Vanport residents. "The dikes are safe at present," it said. "You will be warned if necessary. You will have time to leave. Don't get excited." At 4:17 that afternoon, the Columbia River, swollen 15 feet above normal by snowmelt, punched through the railroad embankment on Vanport's north side. Water poured through the breach and did not stop. Residents had perhaps 35 minutes. There was no evacuation plan. There were no sirens. People grabbed what they could carry, children, documents, nothing, and ran for high ground. The thin-walled apartment buildings, built on no foundations, lifted off the earth and floated, spun in the current, crashed into each other. Ed Washington, who had arrived in Vanport as a 7-year-old in 1944 with his father from Birmingham, Alabama, watched from safe ground as the water lifted the units off the ground and swirled them like toys. He never went back. By evening, Vanport was gone. Not damaged, not partially flooded, gone. Every building, every street, every school, every store. 18,000 people were homeless. The official death count was 15. The actual number is widely believed to be higher because the chaos of the flood made a full accounting impossible. Oregon's second-largest city had been erased in a single afternoon, a city that had been built in 110 days, destroyed in a matter of hours. Vanport was never rebuilt. Today, the site is a golf course, a public park, and the Portland International Raceway. 25% of those left homeless were African American, and their displacement forced a reckoning, incomplete, painful, and ongoing, with Portland's long history of racial exclusion and segregated housing. Many of the displaced families eventually settled in the Albina neighborhood of North Portland, reshaping the city's demographics in ways that echo to this day. 3 years after the flood, in 1951, the Portland Hotel, the building that Henry Villard had dreamed, that McKim, Mead & White had designed, that Henry Corbett and 150 local subscribers had finished, that had hosted presidents and defined Portland's aspirations for 6 decades, closed its doors for the last time. Meyer and Frank, the department store whose flagship stood a block away on Fifth Avenue, had purchased the hotel in 1944 and decided they needed the land for customer parking. On August 15, 1951, the hotel served its last guest. 2 weeks later, on August 28th and 29th, every item in the building was sold at public auction. The china, the silver, the carpets, the plush red hallway runners, the fixtures and furnishings that had once served presidents of the United States, all of it going to the highest bidder. Then the wrecking balls came. They demolished the most ambitious building Portland had ever raised and replaced it with a 2-story parking garage for Meyer and Frank's customers. A $1 million hotel designed by America's most important architects, finished by the civic determination of 150 subscribers who believed in their city, raised to make it easier to park while shopping. The parking garage stood for 30 years. In 1970, when Meyer and Frank applied for a permit to expand it into a 12-story parking tower, the Portland City Council and the Planning Commission balked. They tabled the request and began to consider a different idea entirely: public space. It took 4 more years of planning, and then in 1979, the city acquired the block. They tore down the garage, held a national design competition, and in 1984 opened Pioneer-Courthouse-Square, an open public plaza of 40,000 square feet that Portlanders now call their living room. The inaugural celebration drew over 10,000 people. At the square's south edge, there's a wrought iron fence and archway. It's all that remains of the Portland Hotel. The block where Pioneer Courthouse-Square stands has been, in sequence, forest, a clearing full of whitewashed stumps, a schoolhouse, Portland's first real one, Central School, which opened in 1858, the site of the most ambitious hotel on the West Coast, a parking lot, and a public square. Before any of that, The block was bought in 1849 by a shoemaker named Elijah Hill. He paid $24 and a pair of boots. Before Hill, before Lovejoy, before Pettygrove, the land was Chinookan territory, inhabited for thousands of years by people who made their canoes and longhouse planks from the same trees that Portland's founders turned into stumps. Pettygrove paid $50 for his half of the original claim. 3 years later, a Kentucky-born tanner named Daniel Lownsdale bought Pettygrove's share for $5,000 in tanned leather, not cash, because cash was almost unknown in Oregon at the time. Wheat, furs, and orders drawn on the Hudson's Bay Company were the currency of the territory. Lownsdale's leather was tanned at his own tannery, the first significant one on the Pacific coast, built on a creek that still bears the name Tanner Creek. Lownsdale, who understood that a city needs roads to its hinterland, pushed for the Great Plank Road, a surfaced route connecting Portland to the farmlands of Washington County through a pass in the West Hills. That road, completed in 1851, gave Portland an advantage over every rival town: easier access to the agricultural interior. The farmers who grew the wheat that Portland shipped to the world could actually get their crops to Portland's docks. It was Lownsdale who donated the strip of land that became the South Park blocks, 100 feet wide, still green today, to protect the city from brush fires sweeping in from the hills. From a filing fee of 25 cents to a city of 600,000, from a clearing in the forest to the 27th largest city in the United States, all of it traceable to a handful of people who, at the critical moment, saw what was there before anyone else did. Couch saw the depth of the river. Ladd saw the need for a bank. Villard saw the value of the railroad and gambled everything on trust. Corbett saw a ruined hotel and decided to finish it. Benson saw thirsty workers and gave the city water fountains that still run. Kaiser saw a war that needed ships and built a city in 110 days. None of them set out to build Portland. Each of them set out to solve a problem that was right in front of them. And Portland was the consequence. The accumulation of solved problems, stacked one on top of another over 160 years on 640 acres of riverbank that a sea captain once measured with a sounding line. The Benson bubblers still flow in downtown Portland, their bronze bowls polished by a century of hands. The water runs continuously, winter and summer, about 100,000 gallons a day across all the fountains. They were designed to give men an alternative to drink. Now they're just part of the scenery, so familiar that most Portlanders walk past them without a second thought, which is probably exactly what Simon Benson would have wanted. A few blocks away, where the stumps once stood, where the hotel once rose, where the parking lot once squatted, there is an open square of brick and stone, 40,000 square feet of public space in the middle of the city. People sit on the steps. They wait for the streetcar. Sometimes there are concerts, sometimes protests, sometimes nothing at all. At the south end, the wrought iron archway stands with no building behind it, a gate to nowhere, or to everything that used to be there, depending on how you look at it.